The air that morning of November 8th, 2023, in Paris seemed to carry a different weight, a frigid density that cut through the skin, but what I felt inside was absolute heat, a flame of fury that propelled me. I was in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as I looked through the rearview mirror at the heavy boxes in the back seat containing the 53 Bibles we had painstakingly collected over weeks. Each of those books represented a direct affront to my identity, a shameless invasion into the neighborhoods where our faith was the only pillar. I wasn't just Karim, a 32-year-old man. At that moment, I felt like an executor of justice, tasked with cleaning up the spiritual filth they were trying to impose on us. The sky was gray, a mass of metallic clouds threatening to collapse, but nothing mattered, for my purpose was greater than the weather or civil laws. I felt every beat of my heart like a drum, echoing the promise that this day would be marked in history as the day we said enough to those who wanted to steal our roots. Before continuing, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so you don't miss any testimony, and let us know in the comments where you are listening from. It is very important to have you participating in this community. Now let's get back to the testimony. Roots and foundations. Growing up in Marseille in an Algerian family meant living in a world apart, where the rules of the Quran were the only valid moral compass. My father, who arrived in France in 1989, never allowed us to forget our origins, and the daily wake-up at 4 in the morning for prayer was the sacred ritual that shaped my life from an early age. While the other boys in the neighborhood spent their afternoons playing soccer or getting into trouble, I was submerged in memorizing verses, feeling immense pride when the mosque elders nodded in approval upon hearing me recite chapters without error. I felt special, invested with a mission that the other children would never understand in their pursuit of worldly pleasures. This separation between us and them was the foundation of who I became, a man who saw every concession to secular culture as a betrayal of his lineage and of God, transforming every external criticism into fuel for a devotion that would define my entire future and my actions. In university, my faith became a platform for ideological combat, fueled by the visibility of social media. With over 85,000 followers, I realized my words could ignite hearts and organize resistance movements against government oppression. I posted videos confronting missionaries and felt like the protagonist of a spiritual war necessary for our people's survival. By my side was Amira, a woman whose beauty was surpassed only by her fierce dedication to the same ideals. Our marriage, planned for 2024, was to be the final seal of a life dedicated to preserving our values on foreign soil. I had everything a man could desire: influence, purpose, the respect of the community, and a faithful companion. Nothing seemed capable of shaking the solid structure I had built with such zeal and intellectual aggressiveness, for I was absolutely certain that the truth was exclusively on my side, protected by walls of unshakable certainties. The breaking point. The breaking point occurred in October 2023, when the Emmanuel Project invaded our neighborhoods with an aggressive strategy of Bible distribution and door-to-door conversion. The fury I felt seeing photos of tables in front of our mosques was visceral, a mixture of outrage and fear that our youth would be seduced by foreign words. The final insult came in a package left at my door: 3 French Bibles with a note in Arabic saying they prayed I would discover the truth about Jesus. That was a direct declaration of war against me, the defender of the faith. In that moment of blind rage, as my hands trembled holding those books, the idea for Operation River Cleanup was born as a definitive response. I wanted a symbolic act that would humiliate their religion in the same way I felt they were humiliating ours. The Seine would be the perfect grave for those doctrines, a spectacle the world would watch live through my cameras, never imagining what fate was preparing. We arrived at the meeting point at 2 p.m., a location meticulously chosen near a bridge situated right behind Notre Dame Cathedral. The symbolism was sharp and deliberate. The shadow of France's most famous church would be the silent witness to our revolt against what we called spiritual pollution. My 12 fellow activists were already there, faces tense and determined, hidden under hoods to protect themselves from the biting cold blowing off the river. I distributed the Bibles quickly, 5 or 6 to each person, feeling the weight of the paper and hardcovers in my hands as if they were necessary projectiles. The wind blew hard, stirring the gray and murky waters of the Seine, which ran with indifferent haste below us. There was electricity in the air, a feeling that we were about to cross a line from which there would be no return, and the sight of the cathedral towers in the background only reinforced my conviction that this was a necessary act of resistance for our community. While the others positioned themselves along the bridge's railing, I handled the technical side with almost military precision. I set up the professional camera mounted on a discreet tripod, ensuring the angle perfectly captured the throwing motion and the books falling into the water, with the Christian architecture in the background to maximize visual impact. My fingers, slightly numb from the ice, moved quickly through the live stream settings on my social media. I wanted every detail to be sharp, every splash in the water to be heard by those watching on the other side of the screen. Several other activists also pulled out their phones to film from different angles, a strategy we devised to ensure no one could accuse us of later editing. The tension was physical. I felt a cold sweat despite the low temperature, a mix of adrenaline and the euphoria of knowing that, in a few seconds, I would have the attention of thousands of people focused on my manifesto. The manifestation. I started the broadcast, and within seconds, the viewer count began to climb vertically, jumping from hundreds to thousands. I held one of the Bibles close to the lens, my voice coming out strong and loaded with a contempt I didn't try to hide. I spoke directly to the camera, declaring that those books were the weapons of an invasion we would no longer tolerate, and that Paris would be purified of that affront at that very moment. My companions cheered, some shouting words of support, creating a chorus of defiance that drew the curious and startled looks of passing pedestrians. At my signal, I was the first to act. I grabbed 5 copies and, with a vigorous motion, hurled them over the metal railing. I watched the arc they made in the air before hitting the surface of the Seine with a thud, followed by a rain of books thrown by the others. In less than a minute, all 53 Bibles were in the water, floating as the current dragged them away. The impact on the internet was immediate and explosive, as if we had thrown a match into a fuel tank. The number of simultaneous viewers jumped to 25,000, with the comment section transforming into an uncontrollable blur of fervent support and furious attacks from indignant Christians. I felt invincible, a modern hero fighting an ancient war with 21st century weapons. Watching those books drift away, carried by the river's flow under the gaze of thousands, gave me a sense of power I had never experienced before. It was as if, with every Bible that submerged or drifted off, I was tearing a piece of their influence out of our neighborhood. The plan was working perfectly, and I was already imagining the next day's headlines. However, amidst that celebration of triumph, my eyes fixed on a point in the river, and I realized something in the water's movement was not following the natural logic I expected. What happened next defied every ounce of logic I possessed and froze the blood in my veins. The Bibles, which should have been carried by the natural current of the Seine toward the horizon, simply stopped. They didn't sink, nor did they continue their expected path. They stayed static in the water for a few seconds, as if time had been paused just for those books. Then, before my eyes and the camera lenses, they began to move in the opposite direction of the water's flow. They sailed against the current with impossible precision, gliding over the gray surface as if they had invisible motors attached to each cover. The sound of water hitting the bridge seemed to grow muffled, and a surreal silence began to settle over us. I looked at my companions and saw the same shock plastered on their faces. No one could articulate a single word as we watched the supernatural manifest before us, defying the laws of physics that govern this world so absolutely and terrifyingly. The Holy Presence confusion gave way to reverent dread when the 53 Bibles began to group together directly below where we stood, forming a perfect circle on the river's surface. It wasn't a random formation caused by some whirlpool. It was exact geometry, a ring of books that seemed to have been drawn by an invisible, steady hand. People walking across the bridge began to stop, crowding the railing, pulling out their phones with trembling hands to record the phenomenon. On my phone screen, the number of live stream viewers wouldn't stop climbing, surpassing the 50,000 mark at a staggering speed. I felt a pressure in my chest, a sensation that the air around me had become charged with electricity. The circle of Bibles glowed slightly under the dim Parisian afternoon light, and the contrast between the wet paper and the perfection of the shape they maintained was something my mind refused to process. What was supposed to be an act of mockery was turning into a stage for something I could never have predicted or controlled. Then, the impossible leveled up. Without any warning, the Bibles began to rise out of the water, ascending vertically as if held by invisible wires. They floated until they were about 2 meters above the surface of the Seine, maintaining the perfect circular formation while water dripped from their pages, creating a sound of light rain that was the only audible thing in that moment of collective trance. Several of the activists with me took steps back, moving away from the railing with pale faces and wide eyes. Some began to mutter prayers in Arabic, their voices failing due to genuine fear. I couldn't move. My hands kept holding the camera, but I felt my legs were made of lead. Seeing those books hovering in the air, defying gravity and the very nature of what is physical, broke something inside me. The world around seemed to have disappeared, leaving only me, the circle of Bibles, and a presence I couldn't see, but that filled every inch of space around me with an overwhelming and sacred weight. It was at this moment of absolute shock that the Bibles began to emit a soft white light, which seemed to emanate from within the pages themselves, transforming the circle into a glowing halo against the dark Paris sky. My live stream now had over 100,000 people watching in real time. A global audience witnessing what I could no longer deny was a miracle. Suddenly, a voice filled the environment. It didn't come from any speaker or person, but seemed to sound from everywhere at once, vibrating within my own bones. It was a clear, powerful voice, loaded with an authority I had never heard before, speaking in perfect French that echoed across the bridge and the riverbanks. "Karim, why do you persecute me?" Those words hit me like a physical punch to the stomach, knocking the wind out of me and making my whole body tremble. I knew with a certainty that surpassed any dogma I had ever learned that it was Jesus Christ speaking to me. The authority and the pain in that question were so real that my heart seemed to stop for a moment. The words, "Karim, why do you persecute me?" resonated not just in my ears, but in every fiber of my being, as if they had been engraved into my DNA at that instant. I felt my legs fail completely and had to grab the cold metal of the bridge railing to keep from collapsing. Cold sweat ran down my neck, contrasting with the inexplicable heat emanating from the circle of books. Looking to the side, I saw my friends in a state of absolute shock. One of them was on his knees, covering his face with his hands and sobbing loudly, while others simply backed away, terrified by the manifestation that defied everything we were taught about Jesus. On my phone screen, the live stream comments were a chaotic blur of question marks, virtual screams, and total incredulity, with thousands of people trying to understand if this was an advanced technological trick or reality itself bending before something divine. I knew, however, that no drone or hologram could produce that crushing spiritual weight, that presence that stripped me of all my defenses and certainties, leaving me vulnerable and exposed before the Creator. The message in the sky. While I tried to catch my breath, the circle of Bibles began to move again in the air, in an even more choreographed and hypnotic way, as if the books were pixels on a celestial screen. They reorganized quickly, moving with a soft hum that felt like a vibration of peace, until they formed giant letters hovering over the Seine, visible to anyone on the banks or in the windows of the historic buildings. The letters formed the phrase, "I died for you." The glow coming from within the books became so intense that for a moment the gray Parisian afternoon seemed lit by a sun of its own, a light that didn't hurt the eyes but seemed to penetrate the soul. At that moment, hundreds of people crossing the bridge by car or on foot stopped completely. I saw drivers getting out of their vehicles with expressions of total wonder, people falling to their knees on the wet asphalt, and others simply fleeing in panic, unable to handle what they were witnessing. The silence that followed that phrase was so deep that I could hear only the sound of my own short breaths and the click of cameras recording the impossible. The voice sounded again, but this time it wasn't a whisper directed only to my inner self. It expanded, filling the river valley and echoing off the ancient stones of Notre Dame Cathedral, reaching every soul watching, whether in person or through the cold screen of a phone. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest," the voice said, with a tenderness that made me cry without realizing it. A compassion I had never felt in all my religious journey. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Stop fighting the light. Stop resisting my love." Those declarations were the exact opposite of everything I had preached and defended with such aggressiveness. Every word of Jesus dismantled walls built over 32 years of absolute conviction, revealing a chasm between the God I thought I knew and the God who was there, floating over the waters and calling me by name. I felt excruciating shame for having thrown those Bibles into the river, for having hated the people who carried that message, and at the same time, an inexplicable peace began to invade my chest. As suddenly as it all began, the phenomenon ceased, leaving us in a state of deep sensory disorientation, as if we had been snatched from a lucid dream back into raw reality. The Bibles, which seconds before were glowing and forming phrases in the sky, began to descend gently toward the water, losing their glow and returning to being just books of paper and leather, now floating normally in the Seine. The voice went silent, the heat vanished, and the November afternoon resumed its frigid and somber appearance. But the world would never be the same for anyone on that bridge. The livestream counter now showed over 300,000 people connected in absolute shock. I collapsed against the railing, feeling the weight of my body return with brutal force, while my hands shook so much that my phone ended up falling to the ground, still broadcasting the chaos following the miracle. My companions were silent, some crying softly, others looking at their hands as if they no longer recognized themselves, while the crowd around began to shout and gesture. I knew my life and my safety had just been turned upside down. The aftermath and the choice. The 2 days that followed the miracle on the Seine were, without a doubt, the most confusing and terrifying of my entire life. A blur of camera lights and heavy silences. The video of the broadcast had become an unprecedented global phenomenon, accumulating more than 15 million views across every imaginable platform in less than 48 hours. I couldn't leave my house without being surrounded by journalists from international organizations begging for an interview, wanting to know if I was a prophet or a master of illusion. The French government, under pressure from public opinion and cultural shock, opened an official investigation to determine if we had used some kind of illegal technology or invisible drones to manipulate the scene. I felt trapped in a whirlpool where Christians celebrated the proof of Jesus' divinity, and Muslims looked at me with mortal suspicion, accusing me of having sold my soul for fame or money. The weight of that visibility was overwhelming, and I felt as if I were under a giant microscope, being judged by everyone. The lack of sleep began to corrode my sanity, for every time I closed my eyes, the white light of the Bibles and the powerful voice echoed in my mind with disturbing clarity. I relived the moment on the bridge incessantly, feeling the tremor in my hands and the impact of the words, "Why do you persecute me?" as if they were being whispered in my ear at that very second. My entire identity, built over 32 years on the foundation of being a faithful and uncompromising activist, was crumbling before the undeniable evidence of what my own eyes had seen. I tried to find logical explanations, sought flaws in my own perception, but the truth was too solid to be ignored. I was facing the possibility that everything I believed was wrong. The internal conflict was a physical war, a pain in my chest that wouldn't go away with medicine or ritual prayers, leaving me in a state of emotional exhaustion where I no longer knew who I was or what I should defend from then on, feeling like a traitor to my own history. On November 10th, Amira came to my apartment, and the look on her face is something I will never forget. A mixture of disgust, fear, and a deep hurt that cut through my soul. She didn't come to comfort me but to demand answers, wanting to know if I had planned that theater with some Christian group from the start to gain notoriety. She screamed that I was destroying our future, that our community would never forgive me, and that my father was in a state of shock in Marseille, refusing to eat or speak. When I tried to explain that what happened was real, that I had no control over anything, and that I truly heard the voice of Jesus, she recoiled as if I were infected by a terrible plague. To her, admitting the miracle was the ultimate betrayal of Islam, and she preferred to believe I had gone mad or was an opportunistic traitor rather than accept that the supernatural had manifested against our beliefs. In that moment, I realized that the truth I was beginning to accept would mean the end of all the human bonds I held most dear in the world. The investigation and Father Antoine. The scientific investigation that followed only served to cement my despair, as every expert who analyzed the footage reached the same frustrating conclusion. The phenomenon was unexplainable. Renowned physicists examined the metadata of the original videos and found no traces of wires, magnets, drones, or any digital manipulation that could keep books hovering like that. Hydraulic engineers stated categorically that water-soaked books should behave in a totally different way under the influence of gravity and the Seine's current, making movement against the flow a physical absurdity. There were no millimeter-sized drones capable of lifting that weight, nor projection technology that could create such pure internal light and such an omnipresent voice. I was drowning in concrete evidence that contradicted natural laws, and science was only confirming that I had witnessed something divine. The net was closing. The external evidence was unquestionable, leaving only the decision to accept or continue denying. On November 12th, while I was hiding in my apartment trying to process the chaos, I received a visit I could never have predicted. Father Antoine, from one of the large churches in Paris, knocked on my door, but he didn't bring the arrogance I expected from a Christian leader after a public miracle. He wasn't there to mock my religion or to brag about what happened on the Seine. Instead, he had a look of deep compassion and serenity that instantly disarmed me. He sat on my worn sofa and simply listened, letting me vomit all my dread, confusion, and anger against fate. He spoke little, but every word was loaded with a calm I hadn't found anywhere for days. I realized he didn't see me as an enemy to be defeated, but as a man who had just been run over by the glory of God and needed help getting up from the rubble of his own life. The most impactful moment of the visit was when he pulled one of the Bibles I had thrown into the river out of his bag. The book was water-damaged, with yellowed and wrinkled pages, but he opened it with a care that seemed almost like a caress. He read to me the account from the Gospel of John about Jesus healing a man born blind, focusing on the reaction of the religious leaders of the time, who refused to believe the miracle, even with the healed man standing before them. Father Antoine gently explained that miracles were not spectacles, but revelations of truth for those who had the courage to see. His words pierced my heart, for I realized I was exactly like those leaders. I was trying to explain the unexplainable and deny the obvious because the truth threatened my identity and everything I had built. Seeing that physical book, which I had tried to destroy, now serving as a mirror for my own spiritual blindness, was a devastating experience that left me defenseless. The conversation deepened into the fundamental difference between what I had learned my whole life and what was happening now. Islam had taught me that Jesus was only a prophet, someone who did not die on the cross and who could never be the Son of God. But the miracle on the Seine and the words I heard, "I died for you," told a radically different story. Father Antoine didn't try to forcibly convert me. He just laid the facts before me. Either what I saw was a meaningless collective illusion, or Jesus was exactly who the Christians said he was. This duality was unbearable, for accepting the truth meant admitting that 32 years of my life were based on an incomplete understanding of God's nature. I felt the weight of my father's heritage and the expectations of my community on my shoulders, but the light from the pages of that wet Bible seemed to shine with an intensity that no human logic or religious tradition could extinguish. Before leaving, the priest invited me to go to his private office at the church to talk more calmly and study what the Bible really taught. The invitation caused immediate, visceral terror. I knew that if anyone from the Muslim community saw me entering a church to speak with a priest, my life would be in real and immediate danger. The risk of being cut off from my family, losing my friends, and being hunted by those who once admired me was a concrete reality that paralyzed me with fear. However, the terror of rejecting the truth after God had revealed himself to me so dramatically was even greater than the fear of physical death. I was at a crossroads where every path seemed to lead to a form of sacrifice, but the search for the peace I had briefly felt on the bridge pushed me to take the risk. I agreed to meet him the following week, knowing that step would be the beginning of the end of the life I knew. The turning point. Over the following week, I met with Father Antoine 3 times in his private office, a place that smelled of old paper and coffee, far from the eyes of my community. He didn't try to manipulate me or use grand rhetoric. He just opened the Bible and showed me, with a patience that both irritated and attracted me, who Jesus claimed to be. The difference between what I had learned in Islam and what was on those pages was an insurmountable chasm I could no longer ignore. While my previous faith taught that Jesus was a human prophet who was never crucified, what I read there was about a God who became man and chose to die to pay the debt of my sin. It was impossible to reconcile the two visions. There was no comfortable middle ground. Either Islam was right and what I saw on the bridge was an unexplainable sham, or Christianity was the truth, and I had been fighting against the creator of the universe for 32 years. Every verse I read seemed to strip away a layer of the armor I used to protect myself from the outside world. The definitive turning point happened on November 18th, exactly 10 days after the miracle on the Seine. I was alone in my apartment, curtains closed and lights off, watching the live stream video for the 100th time, looking for any detail that could give me a logical way out. That was when I noticed something that had gone unnoticed in the chaos. At the moment the Bibles formed the words, "I died for you," the camera panned for a brief second and captured my face reflected in a nearby shop window. I saw in my own eyes an expression of absolute terror, mixed with deep, undeniable recognition. In that moment, I stopped fighting. I realized I had known the truth from the first second on the bridge, but the fear of losing my life, my family, and my status was what kept me denying the obvious. I was exhausted from carrying the weight of a lie I tried to sustain with tooth and nail, while the truth shone before me with the strength of 1,000 suns, waiting only for me to have the courage to surrender. Without planning it, I set my phone aside and fell to my knees in the middle of the room, feeling the cold carpet under my legs. But for the first time in my entire life, I didn't turn toward Mecca. nor did I recite the memorized prayers my father had taught me since I was 4 years old. I simply looked at the ceiling, tears flowing freely, and prayed directly to Jesus with an honesty I never knew I possessed. Jesus, if you are truly God, if you really died for me, I can't fight you anymore, I whispered, my voice choked with crying. I asked for forgiveness for throwing his word into the river, for sowing hatred against his followers, and for being so blind to the love he was showing me. It wasn't a complex theological prayer. It was the cry of a broken man who realized his religion was a prison of rules and that freedom was in a person he had tried to destroy. At that instant, I was surrendering not just my faith, but my entire existence into the hands of the one I used to call my enemy. The answer I received was not an external voice or a new sign in the sky, but something much deeper and more transformative. A supernatural peace, the exact same one I felt briefly in the middle of the miracle on the bridge, flooded every cell of my body, washing away the anguish and dread that had consumed me for days. It was as if a weight of tons, which I didn't even know I was carrying, was lifted off my shoulders in the blink of an eye. There was no longer the need to prove my devotion through works or religious aggressiveness. I felt loved in a way that Islam had never allowed me to feel, a love that didn't depend on my performance, but on the sacrifice he had already made. I cried for hours on end, a mixture of sadness for the life I knew I was about to lose, and an indescribable joy for the truth that had finally found me. When I stood up from that floor, I was no longer the Karim who organized the protest. I was a new man, transformed by a grace I didn't deserve, and which was now the only thing that mattered to me. The price of truth. Telling Amira about my conversion was, without a doubt, the most painful and difficult conversation of my entire life. We met in a small cafe in central Paris on November 20th, a neutral place where the noise of the coffee machines tried to drown out the heavy silence between us. As soon as she sat down, she realized something in me had changed drastically. I no longer had that defensive agitation, replaced by a calm that seemed to scare her more than my habitual fury. I told her everything, hiding nothing. I told her about the meetings with Father Antoine, about how the words of the Bible seemed to burn my soul, and about the moment when, alone in my room, I surrendered to Jesus. I tried to explain that it wasn't a political choice or a cultural betrayal, but an inevitable response to something real that found me. Amira listened with wide eyes, her face pale in an expression of horror, as if I were confessing an unpardonable crime against our history and against the love we swore to each other before our families. Her reaction was a violent mix of denial and despair that cut through me like a sharp blade. At first, she laughed nervously, saying I was just under stress because of the video's backlash and that I needed to see an imam to cleanse myself of these confused ideas. But when she realized I was serious, that I truly believed Jesus was God and that my life now belonged to him, her expression changed to a cold, deadly fury. She said I was throwing our life in the trash, that I would be hunted by our own people, and that she could never marry a murtad, an apostate who betrayed the blood of his ancestors. They are going to kill you, Karim, not the government, but our own people. You are dead to us, she said, with a voice that no longer trembled. It was the loneliest moment of my existence, seeing the woman I loved look at me as if I were a monster, while I only tried to share the peace I had finally found amidst the chaos. The outcome of that meeting sealed the end of my previous life in a definitive and cruel way. Amira didn't cry anymore. She simply removed the engagement ring we had chosen with so much hope for 2024 and placed it on the cold marble table of the cafe. That small circle of gold, which represented all our plans, children, and dreams, now seemed like a shackle that had just been broken. She stood up without saying another word, without giving me a last look of farewell, and walked toward the door, leaving me alone with the indifferent noise of the Parisian cafe. I sat there for a long time, looking at the ring, feeling the weight of the world collapse upon me. I knew that from that instant on, I no longer had a fiancé, I no longer had a planned future, and the safety of my old world had disappeared forever. The price of truth was starting to be charged, and the bill was total isolation from everything I once considered essential to my identity. The next blow came from Marseille, through a call from my father that still resonates in my nightmares with terrifying clarity. He didn't scream. His voice was a breath of ice and hatred that seemed to come from an infinite distance, full of an authority I had always respected and that now condemned me. He declared that the name Karim no longer belonged to me, that I was officially erased from our family lineage. and that no one in that house would ever utter my name again as long as he lived. I could hear my mother's muffled crying in the background, a sound that tore through my chest in a way no physical threat could, for I knew I would never again smell her food or hear her voice calling me. My sister sent messages loaded with contempt, saying I was their shame and that I should disappear forever. In a few hours, my social media, which used to be my stage of power, transformed into a sewer of death threats and promises of violence from people who used to call me a hero and a soldier. A new beginning. The persecution didn't just stay on screens. It became physical and suffocating in a matter of days. I had to abandon my apartment in a hurry, carrying only the essentials in a backpack, as neighbors and old acquaintances began to loiter around the building with violent intentions, while the landlord was pressured to evict me so as not to attract trouble for the other residents. I became a ghost in my own city, changing addresses to safe locations provided by the support network of Father Antoine and other Christians who were moved by my situation. But in the midst of this forced isolation and constant fear, something extraordinary began to bloom. Although I had lost thousands of followers of hate, hundreds of other Muslims began to send me private messages, confessing that the video of the Seine had left them sleepless. Many admitted that, for the first time, they felt the courage to question the doctrines they had always accepted only out of fear. I realized that my public fall was, in fact, a bridge for others to cross toward the light. It was through Father Antoine that I met a vibrant community of ex-Muslims converted to Christianity scattered throughout Europe. Finding these people was like finding an oasis in the middle of the desert. They spoke my language, understood the unbearable weight of family rejection, and carried the same scars as those who lost everything to gain the true life. They didn't treat me like an internet celebrity or an object of curiosity, but like a brother who had just come out of a spiritual war zone. I learned from them that following Jesus was not a journey of temporary eases, but of a faithfulness that cost dearly and is worth every sacrifice. I received from them financial and emotional support, and above all, a friendship that wasn't based on how well I fulfilled rituals, but on the grace we all shared. For the first time in 32 years, I didn't have to be the perfect soldier to be accepted and loved. I was just Karim, a forgiven man learning to walk in a new, unknown land. The day of my baptism was set for December 25, 2023, Christmas, a date that carried a divine irony I could never have planned in my old life. While the Western world celebrated the birth of Jesus, I prepared for my own public spiritual birth in Father Antoine's parish. Tension was palpable throughout the neighborhood, as we knew the event would draw eyes from all sides, including those who still actively wished me harm. We decided to broadcast the ceremony live, not for fame, but as a final testimony that God's light cannot be hidden under a box of fear or intimidation. More than 500,000 people connected from all parts of the globe to see the man who threw Bibles into the river a month earlier, now voluntarily submitting to Christian baptism. My heart beat with a force I felt in my neck, but it wasn't the fear of death moving me. It was the burning desire to declare to the universe that I no longer belonged to the darkness. When Father Antoine dipped me into the baptismal tank, the silence inside the church was absolute, broken only by the soft sound of water stirring against the edges. In that instant of complete submersion, I felt as if the old Karim, the furious activist, the proud son of blind tradition, the man who hated without knowing, was being left behind at the bottom of those waters, never to return. Upon being raised out, I breathed air that seemed purer and lighter, as if my lungs had been renewed by a divine breath directly from heaven. The symbolism was perfect and overwhelming for everyone present. I had been buried with Christ and now rose to a totally new life, dedicated to spreading the same truth I had previously tried to eradicate with such fury. The tears that mixed with the baptismal water on my face were of a joy that human words can barely describe. I was finally free from the guilt and hatred that consumed my youth in Paris. The legacy of the Seine. In early 2024, my life found a new foundation through a Christian organization dedicated to supporting ex-Muslims throughout Europe. They were the hands of God for me, providing not only safe housing and financial support during my transition, but also a renewed purpose, sharing my testimony in churches and conferences. It was in this context of healing that I met Sophie, a woman whose faith was as deep as her compassion for those who suffer. Unlike Amira, who loved me only as long as I played the role of a good Muslim, Sophie saw me as a new creature, loved by Christ regardless of my aggressive past. We married in September 2024 in a simple and beautiful ceremony, celebrating the faithfulness of a God who rescues the lost from the ashes of hatred. Having a family founded on grace transformed my pain into a solid hope, proving that the sacrifice of losing my old world was small compared to the magnitude of the peace that now dwells in my home. The impact of what happened on the Seine continued to reverberate in ways that defy any human prediction. In mid-2024, I received private messages from 3 of the activists who were with me on that bridge in November. They confessed that since that day, they could no longer sleep in peace or perform ritual prayers with the same conviction. The sight of the Bibles floating against the current and the voice of Jesus haunted them constantly, forcing them to question everything they believed. We began to meet secretly to study the scriptures, and, one by one, they surrendered their lives to the Messiah, finding the same liberation I experienced. Seeing those men, who used to scream with me against Christian pollution, now crying with joy upon discovering salvation through Jesus, was the final proof that that miracle was not an isolated event just for me, but a powerful collective calling for all who were willing to truly see and hear the truth. In November 2024, exactly 1 year after the miracle, we organized a worship event on the same bridge where my life was turned upside down. With permission from French authorities, we gathered more than 1,000 believers to sing and testify at the exact location where I had previously tried to silence the word of God with mockery. I held in my hands one of the Bibles recovered from the river, whose pages still bear the yellowed marks of the water and the miracle, and I preached to a crowd of curious onlookers and Muslims drawn by the story of the live stream. That day, 27 people surrendered their lives to Jesus right there, under the freezing Paris sky, transforming the site of my greatest sin into the stage of a mass redemption. The circle closed gloriously. The waters I wanted to use to hide the truth became the setting where the light of Christ shone brightest, proving that no act of human hatred is capable of drowning the love God has for each of us. Today, when I look back, I realize that the phenomenon on the Seine remains to this day without any logical or scientific explanation, defying all reports from the world's greatest experts in physics and technology. That white light emanating from inside the books, the impossible movement against the current, and the omnipresent voice that called me by name are mysteries that human reason simply cannot process or replicate. The experience simply happened at that precise moment, transformed my being irrevocably, and then ceased, leaving behind only the silence of faith and a permanent mark on my soul. I no longer feel the need to explain the miracle to convince skeptics, for the greatest proof is my own life rebuilt upon the ruins of who I used to be. The miracle was a portal that opened and closed, leaving me with an absolute inability to understand the phenomenon logically even today, but with the eternal certainty that I was found by the Creator in the murky waters of my own rebellion.
What would you do if God proved today that everything you believe about religion is completely wrong? Share your experience or opinion here in the comments. We really want to hear from you. Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss any of our next transformative content. Click now on the recommended video appearing on the screen to continue following these incredible stories. Thank you very much, and God bless you.